June 6, 1944, 0730 hours, Omaha Beach, France. A 26-year-old first lieutenant walks out into the open, completely exposed, through a minefield filled with German teller mines capable of blowing a man in half. He's not running, he's not crawling, he's walking upright, in full view of German machine gun positions 400 yards away, banging on the side of a 33-ton Sherman tank with his fist. The tank is buttoned up, sealed shut, because the crew inside is terrified of the machine gun fire ripping across the beach. They can't see where they're going. They're blind. And this lieutenant, this red-headed kid from Virginia, is guiding them through the minefield like a traffic cop directing cars in downtown Richmond. His name was Jimmie Monteith, not a career soldier, not a West Point graduate, a college dropout who'd been in the Army for less than 3 years. How did a kid who couldn't finish mechanical engineering become the man who single-handedly opened the exit that saved the D-Day invasion? The man Eisenhower personally called good? To understand what Jimmie Monteith did in the first 3 hours of D-Day, you need to understand where he was and what he was fighting against. Company L of the 16th Infantry Regiment was supposed to land at 0630 hours on a section of Omaha Beach called Fox Red, directly in front of a small village called Colville-sur-Mer. They landed 30 minutes late, 1,000 yards east of where they were supposed to be, directly in front of the most heavily fortified position on the entire beach. Omaha Beach, June 6, 1944, was the linchpin of the entire Allied invasion of Europe. If Omaha failed, the invasion failed. If the invasion failed, the war in Europe could have lasted years longer. But there was a problem. The Germans had spent 4 years fortifying this 5-mile stretch of beach. They'd turned it into a killing ground. Concrete bunkers, interlocking fields of fire, artillery positions on the high ground. And between the beach and safety, 4 exits, 4 narrow valleys where roads cut through the 150-foot cliffs. The Allies called them draws. The Germans called them kill zones. On one side, the 352nd Infantry Division, battle-hardened troops who'd been fighting since 1940, positioned in reinforced concrete bunkers with pre-sighted artillery, mortars, and machine guns covering every inch of beach. Resistance Nest WN-60, Monteith's target, had 4 machine gun positions, 2 anti-tank guns, 1 mortar pit, and over 60 German soldiers. On the other side, 200 American soldiers from Company L, most of whom had never seen combat, landing in 6 boats with their heavy weapons at the bottom of the English Channel because the landing craft sank. It was David versus Goliath, and worse, the environment was a 300-yard open killing field with 0 cover. Imagine a football field, now triple it. Now fill it with barbed wire, wooden obstacles, landmines, and metal hedgehogs designed to rip open landing craft. Now, tilted upward at a 30-degree angle toward concrete bunkers firing down at you. This wasn't just a beach, it was an open-air execution chamber, and every single German gun in that sector could hit any point on it. And in the middle of that hell was First Lieutenant Jimmie W, Monteith Jr., 6'2", red hair, 26 years old. If you saw him in a photograph, you wouldn't think he was a combat officer who'd fought through Sicily. You'd think he was, well, exactly what he was, a kid from the Blue Ridge Mountains who'd worked in his father's coal company. Jimmie Monteith was born on July 1, 1917, in Low Moor, Virginia, a company town in the Allegheny Mountains. His father was vice president of a coal company. Not wealthy, but comfortable. Middle class in an era when most people weren't. But here's what you need to understand about Low Moor in 1917. It was a company town. The coal company owned the houses. The coal company owned the store. The coal company owned everything. It was the era of the Great Depression, World War I, and the collapse of American industry. Jimmie went to Virginia Tech in 1937 to study mechanical engineering. And he failed. Not because he wasn't smart, not because he didn't work hard, but because, and this is from his own letters, he got distracted. He lost focus. He dropped out after 2 years. It was the biggest regret of his life. In letters home during the war, he wrote, "I know my educational failure has always been a big disappointment to Father and is one of the things I would change if I had it to do over." His father died in August 1942 while Jimmie was in training at Fort McClellan. He never got to tell his father that he'd become an officer, never got to prove that he wasn't a failure. Now, if you've never carried the weight of disappointing your family, you don't understand what that does to a person. It creates a hole, a need to prove yourself, a need to show that you're worth something. Virginia Tech taught Jimmie Monteith the principles of mechanical engineering. The coal mines taught him how machines worked under pressure. The Army taught him how to lead men. But failure, his own failure, the failure he carried with him every day, taught him something else. It taught him that you don't get second chances, that when the moment comes, you act, that redemption doesn't come from talking about what you should have done. The Army made him a first lieutenant, but regret made him a man who would walk through a minefield rather than watch other men die because he hesitated. And in October 1941, when he was 24 years old, he was drafted. For 3 years, he trained, Officer Candidate School at Fort Benning, commissioned as a second lieutenant in June 1942. He specifically requested assignment to the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, the most famous American division in the war. July 1943, Sicily invasion. Monteith led his platoon through street fighting in Gela. Field promotion to 1st. Lieutenant, January to May 1944. England, training, preparing. Knowing that the invasion was coming but not knowing when. And in each of these situations, Jimmie Monteith used the same analytical approach he'd learned studying mechanical engineering. The Army taught him to follow doctrine, but engineering had taught him to solve problems, to look at a system, find the weak point, and exploit it. And on June 6, 1944, all these skills would be put to the test. On the morning of June 6th, Monteith's landing craft hit the beach at 700 hours, 30 minutes late, 1,000 yards east of the target. The ramp dropped. The first man off was cut down immediately. The second man off was hit before he reached the water. Monteith jumped into chest-deep water under a hail of machine gun fire that, according to witnesses, sounded like hail hitting a tin roof. Of the 200 men in Company L, roughly 125 made it to temporary cover at the base of the cliff. 75 were dead or wounded in the first 10 minutes. The company commander, Captain John Armelino, was seriously wounded trying to coordinate the attack. And then Monteith saw something that changed everything. 2 Sherman tanks from the 741st Tank Battalion were sitting on the beach, engines running, completely buttoned up, sealed shut, because the machine gun fire was so intense, the crews were afraid to open the hatches. They couldn't see, they couldn't navigate. They were 33 tons of mobile artillery doing absolutely nothing while American soldiers died 50 yards away. And Monteith, this 26-year-old lieutenant, this college dropout, this kid who'd spent 2 years learning how machines work, looked at those tanks and understood exactly what needed to happen. Someone had to walk out into the open, through a minefield, under machine gun fire, and guide those tanks to where they could shoot back. It was a death sentence. Everyone knew it. Jimmie Monteith walked out into the minefield immediately. He grabbed 3 things: his M1 Garand rifle, a Bangalore torpedo for breaching barbed wire, and the absolute certainty that if he didn't do this, everyone on that beach would die. He walked approximately 100 yards, 91 meters, across open sand, while German MG-42 machine guns fired 1,200 rounds per minute at him. And here's the trick. He wasn't running. He wasn't zigzagging. He was walking at a steady pace, banging on the side of the tank hulls with his fist. The tank crews inside couldn't hear radio communications over the sound of their engines and the gunfire. So Monteith used the only method that would work. He physically hit the tanks and pointed. Sergeant Aaron B. Jones, who witnessed this, later said, "On the beach were two tanks, buttoned up and blind because of heavy machine gun fire that was directed on them. He walked through all that fire to bang on the sides of the tanks and instruct the men inside to follow him." Just as an engineer inspects a piece of machinery, he was moving deliberately, systematically, directing the tanks like they were tools he was positioning. He led those tanks 200 yards forward, beyond the high water mark, beyond the seawall, through a minefield, into direct line of sight of the German bunkers. Think about that for a second. German Teller mines were pressure-activated. 30 pounds of pressure would detonate them. A man weighed about 150 to 200 pounds. Monteith was walking through a field where any step could be his last, leading tanks that weighed 33 tons, vehicles that would absolutely trigger any mine they rolled over. But he knew something the Germans didn't expect. The mines were buried at a depth designed to catch the broad treads of a tank. If you knew where to look, disturbed soil, slight depressions, geometric patterns, you could see them. And Monteith had spent 2 years learning to see patterns in mechanical systems. And then he positioned them exactly where they needed to be. Hull-down positions where they could fire at the German pillboxes without exposing their thin belly armor. The Germans in WN-60, the resistance nest at 130 feet elevation, had a perfect view of the entire beach. 4 machine gun positions, 2 anti-tank guns, 1 mortar pit, over 60 soldiers. And Monteith, standing next to a tank completely exposed, started directing fire. The 75mm cannon on the Sherman had a maximum effective range of about 2,000 yards. The German pillboxes were 400 yards away. Point-blank range. Pillbox, 11 o'clock, fire. The tank fired. The concrete exploded. German machine gun position eliminated. Bunker entrance, 2 o'clock, fire. Another position destroyed. One by one, Monteith walked those tanks through their targets, destroying the German positions that had been slaughtering Americans for the past hour. The Germans knew there was an American officer somewhere coordinating this. They started searching with their machine guns, walking fire across the beach. They fired within 50 meters of Monteith's position, then 30 meters, then 10 meters. Some witnesses say the rounds were hitting within 5 feet, so close that Monteith could feel the shock waves from the bullets passing by his head, so close that sand was kicking up into his face, and they never hit him. Why? Because Jimmie Monteith wasn't panicking, he wasn't running, he wasn't making himself a target through erratic movement. He was using his engineering brain, calculating angles, calculating fields of fire, staying in the one spot where multiple German positions created a blind spot in their overlapping fire. He had spent 2 years learning to analyze mechanical systems and find their weaknesses. German defensive positions? They were just another system to solve. After the tanks destroyed several key positions, Monteith ran back across the beach, again through the minefield, to where his men were pinned down. He organized them. He set up a Bangalore torpedo, a long tube filled with explosives, designed to blow a hole through barbed wire. The explosion created a gap. Monteith led his men through, then through a second minefield, then up the slope toward WN-60. By shortly after 0800 hours, less than 90 minutes after landing, Company L had captured the most important German position on the eastern end of Omaha Beach. They took prisoners. They established a defensive perimeter approximately 600 yards inland, with a front of about 250 meters. And for the first time since the invasion started, there was a hole in the German defenses. The Cabourg Draw, the easternmost exit from Omaha Beach, was open. But the Germans weren't done. But there was a problem. Company L had taken the position, but they were isolated, cut off, and the Germans wanted it back. Hour 2. The German counterattacks began. Monteith's men were now defending a position approximately 600 yards inland, on high ground, with about 250 meters of front to cover. They had maybe 100 men left, no heavy weapons, limited ammunition. And the Germans, who knew this terrain, who had pre-planned counterattack routes, who had reinforcements, started hitting them from multiple directions, first from the east, then from the north, then from the rear. Monteith was everywhere. He ran across 200 yards of open ground, repeatedly, under fire, moving between isolated groups of his men, strengthening the defensive line, bringing ammunition, coordinating fields of fire. Sergeant Jones watched him cross that open ground 6 times, not crawling, not using cover, running upright because it was faster, and his men needed him now, not in 5 minutes. And then the Germans surrounded them completely. They called for surrender. Monteith looked at the German positions, looked at his men behind him. He knew that if they surrendered, the Germans would retake WN 60. They'd retake the high ground. They'd close the Cabourg Draw, and thousands of Americans still landing on the beach below would be slaughtered. He could save his men by surrendering, or he could save the invasion. Jimmie Monteith picked up an M7 rifle grenade launcher. For those of you who don't know, an M7 grenade launcher was a tube that attached to the end of an M1 Garand rifle. You loaded a special grenade into it, used a blank cartridge to launch it, and it had an effective range of about 200 yards. But effective range and accurate range are different things. To hit a target at 200 yards with a rifle grenade, you needed to understand trajectory, windage, and the parabolic arc of the projectile. You needed to understand mechanical engineering. Monteith moved toward the sound of German voices. He saw a machine gun position, 40 yards away. In the open, he raised the rifle, calculated the angle, and fired. The first grenade fell short. Every German machine gun in that sector immediately turned toward him. An MG-42 machine gun fires 200 rounds per minute. That's 20 rounds per second. At 40 yards, 120 feet, the bullets would reach him in less than a tenth of a second. Sergeant Jones watched this happen. He said, "He stood in full view at 40 yards, and the first shot fell short. The full fire of the gun was turned upon him, but he held his position and fired the second grenade to knock out the position." Think about that. Monteith stood there, exposed, while a machine gun fired directly at him, and calmly reloaded and fired again. The second grenade destroyed the position. Then he moved to another German gun, destroyed it with hand grenades. Then he saw a third position, 200 yards away, firing from the east into the rear of his defensive line. He started back across the open field to deal with it. And that's when they got him, a German light machine gun, probably an MG-34, firing from a position they'd moved up to their rear. Jimmie Monteith was killed instantly. He was 26 years old. He'd been on French soil for approximately 4 hours. Here's what happened next. Despite losing their leader, Company L held WN 60. By midday, the position was secure. The Cabourg Draw was open. Tanks, vehicles, and reinforcements started moving inland through the exit Monteith had captured. By the end of D-Day, 34,000 American troops were ashore at Omaha Beach. The invasion succeeded. But here's what you need to understand about medals and recognition in World War II. Jimmie Monteith's immediate superiors, the men who saw what he did, recommended him for the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest award for valor. The V Corps commander agreed. Distinguished Service Cross. The 1st Army commander agreed. Distinguished Service Cross. The 12th Army Group commander agreed. Distinguished Service Cross. Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's Chief of Staff, reviewed the recommendation and concurred. Distinguished Service Cross. And then the paperwork reached General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in Europe, the man responsible for the entire invasion, the man who just gambled everything on the beaches of Normandy. Eisenhower read the citation, and he picked up a pen and wrote a note to Bedell Smith. The exact words were, "Bedell, you are mistaken. Bradley recommends the Medal of Honor, and I must say the thing looks like a Medal of Honor for me. This man was good." 4 words that changed everything. This man was good. Not this man was brave. Not this man was heroic. This man was good. From Eisenhower, a man who'd commanded millions of soldiers, who'd seen countless acts of valor, who had to weigh every medal against the standard of what truly mattered. That was the highest compliment possible. Eisenhower personally upgraded Monteith's award to the Medal of Honor. The medal was presented on March 19, 1945, at the Monteith family home in Richmond, Virginia. Jimmie's mother received it. His father had died in 1942. His sister Nancy was there. Years later, Nancy said, "He was heaped with honors after the war, but I'd rather have him back." Jimmie Monteith is buried at the Normandy American Cemetery and Memorial, Plot Y, Row 20, Grave 12. If you ever visit, and you should, look for his headstone. It has gold lettering. That's how they mark Medal of Honor recipients. 9,387 American soldiers are buried at that cemetery. Only 4 have gold lettering. Jimmie Monteith is one of them. Now, here's the question that matters. What did Jimmie Monteith actually accomplish? Because it's one thing to say he was brave. It's another thing to understand the tactical and strategic impact of what he did in those 4 hours. Let me put it in perspective. The entire D-Day invasion, the largest amphibious assault in human history, came down to 4 exits from Omaha Beach, 4 roads through the cliffs. If the Germans held those exits, they could contain the invasion on the beach. And if they contained it on the beach, they could destroy it with artillery and counterattacks. The Cabourg Draw, the exit Monteith opened, was the easternmost of those 4 exits. And here's what makes it crucial. It was the only exit that allowed rapid movement to Colville-sur-Mer and then east toward the British beaches at Gold. If that exit stayed closed, the American and British sectors would have remained separated. The Germans could have driven a wedge between them. They could have defeated the invasion in detail, destroy the Americans, then turn on the British. By 1200 hours on June 6th, roughly 4 hours after Monteith died, American tanks and vehicles were moving inland through the Cabourg Draw. By nightfall, the 1st Infantry Division had pushed nearly a mile inland in that sector. By June 7th, the American and British forces had linked up. The invasion was secure. The Department of Defense, in their official assessment, stated, "Of all the men who fought and died on D-Day, Army First Lieutenant Jimmie W. Monteith Jr.'s actions might have been the most crucial toward the Allies gaining a foothold in Europe." Not important, not significant, most crucial. One man, one decision, one moment of walking into certain death because someone had to do it, changed the course of World War II. Now, I want to be clear about something, because this is important for understanding military history. Monteith didn't win D-Day by himself. Thousands of men fought. Thousands died. Many others performed extraordinary acts of valor that day. But military success often comes down to specific moments, tactical problems that need to be solved right now, in real time, with imperfect information and overwhelming danger. And at Omaha Beach, in the first hour, the tactical problem was this. American soldiers were dying on the beach because they couldn't suppress the German positions, and they couldn't suppress the German positions because the supporting armor was blind and immobilized. Someone had to solve that problem. Monteith solved it, not through courage alone, though he had that, not through training alone, though he had that too, but through the ability to see a mechanical problem, understand the solution, and execute it despite the near certainty of death. That's what made him irreplaceable at that moment. So what's the lesson here? What do we take away from Jimmie Monteith's story? I think there are 3 things. First, failure doesn't define you. Your response to failure defines you. Jimmie Monteith was a college dropout. He carried that shame with him for years. In his letters, he talked about disappointing his father, but on June 6, 1944, none of that mattered. What mattered was that he'd learned to analyze systems. He'd learned to solve problems, and when the moment came, he used those skills to save thousands of lives. The engineering degree he never finished taught him more than any diploma could have. Second, leadership isn't about rank, it's about action. When Monteith landed on Omaha Beach, The company commander was wounded. The command structure was broken. The plan had fallen apart. Monteith didn't wait for orders. He didn't ask permission. He saw what needed to be done, and he did it. He walked out into a minefield because 2 tanks were sitting idle. He led his men up a cliff because that's where they needed to go. He attacked German positions when surrounded because surrender meant defeat. At no point did he say, "That's not my job," or "Someone else should do this." He acted. Third, and this is the hard one, sometimes doing the right thing means accepting that you won't see the outcome. Monteith knew he was going to die. When he walked out to those tanks, he knew. When he led the assault on WN-60, he knew. When he stood in the open firing rifle grenades at a machine gun, he absolutely knew. But he also knew that if he didn't do it, the men behind him would die, and the men landing on the beach would die, and the invasion would fail. So he made the trade. His life for the mission, his life for his men, his life for the chance, just the chance, that D-Day would succeed. That's not courage. That's beyond courage. That's the cold calculation that your death matters less than their survival. And he was right. The invasion succeeded. Thousands of men who would have died on that beach lived. The war in Europe ended 11 months later. Jimmie Monteith never saw any of it. He died at 26, buried in French soil, 3,700 miles from the Virginia mountains where he grew up. But here's what he did see in those last moments. He saw his men reach the top of the cliff. He saw the German position fall. He saw the exit open. He saw Americans moving inland. He saw that it worked, and maybe, just maybe. In that final moment, as he ran back across that field, he knew that he'd proven his father wrong. He wasn't a failure. He was good. On March 29, 1945, the War Department issued General Orders No. 20, awarding the Medal of Honor to First Lieutenant Jimmie Monteith Jr. posthumously for actions on June 6, 1944. The citation ends with these words: "His gallant leadership and intrepid actions enabled his company to breach the Atlantic Wall defenses and set an example of bravery and courage under fire." But I prefer Eisenhower's version. This man was good. 4 words. From the Supreme Commander of Allied Forces, about a 26-year-old college dropout from Virginia who walked through a minefield to save an invasion. If you ever find yourself thinking you're not good enough, that you failed, that you're not qualified, that someone else should do it, remember Jimmie Monteith. Remember that the man who helped save D-Day was carrying the shame of dropping out of college. Remember that when the moment came, none of that mattered. What mattered was that he acted. Jimmie Monteith, 1st Lieutenant, 16th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, Medal of Honor recipient. The man who was good.